Life has a strange way of unfolding, doesn't it? You start with dreams, some big, some small, and you set out with every intention of making them come true. You make careful choices, believing that if you do everything right, life will reward you. You pick the right man, the right career, the right path, and you tell yourself that things will fall into place. But somewhere along the way the ground shifts beneath your feet. Slowly, quietly. Until one day you wake up in a life you no longer recognize. His name was James. We met when I was 22, fresh out of college, just starting my first job as a nurse at a hospital in Austin, Texas. James worked as a mechanic at a small garage not far from my apartment. I wasn't looking for love. I was focused on my career, eager to prove myself in a demanding world. But James had this quiet warmth about him, an easy confidence that made the world feel a little softer when he was around. He wasn't flashy or over the top. He was just James. And I fell for him. Those early days felt like something out of a movie. He'd surprise me at work with lunch, always remembering my favorite, turkey on rye with extra pickles. I'd leave little notes in his toolbox, playful scribbles like "you make me smile" or "don't work too hard." We couldn't keep our hands off each other, and it wasn't just the physical connection, though that was incredible. It was the way he'd hold my hand as we walked, the way he'd brush my hair from my face when he kissed me. With James I felt seen. We married a year later, a small but perfect ceremony by the lake, surrounded by close friends and family. I remember standing under the shade of an old oak tree, looking into his eyes as we exchanged vows, convinced I had found my forever. For a while it was everything I had hoped for. We moved into a cozy little house with a front porch swing, just enough space for the children we planned to have someday. James worked long hours at the garage while I took night shifts at the hospital. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, and that felt like enough. But love alone doesn't shield you from the weight of the world. The long days turned into longer weeks. Bills stacked up. Stress crept into the spaces where laughter used to be. James would come home exhausted, too tired to talk, too drained to hold me like he used to. I told myself it was just a phase, that once we settled into a rhythm, things would return to the way they were. And for a while I believed that. Then the small changes became impossible to ignore. He stopped bringing me lunch. The notes I left in his toolbox went unnoticed. Conversations became clipped exchanges, discussions about bills, grocery lists, schedules. We passed each other like strangers in our own home. And in the bedroom, the distance between us became a canyon. James had always been different, attentive, passionate. He made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. But over time, even that faded. He'd come to bed late, exhausted. And when we did make love, it was quick, almost perfunctory. 2 minutes, sometimes less. I tried to be understanding. I told myself he was stressed, that it wasn't about me, that things would get better. But as the weeks turned into months and the months into years, I began to lose hope. I remember the first night I cried over it. A Tuesday. James had fallen asleep on the couch again. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling lonelier than I ever had. I wanted to shake him awake, to demand, "Don't you see me? Don't you care?" But I didn't. Instead, I turned off the light and let silent tears soak into my pillow. No one tells you how lonely marriage can be. You're supposed to be a team, but what happens when one of you stops showing up? When the person who once made your heart race becomes just another piece of the background. I held on for as long as I could. I told myself that love was about sacrifice, about endurance, about staying even when it hurt. But deep down I was starving. Starving for someone to look at me the way James used to. For someone to remind me that I was still alive, still desirable, still seen. And that's when it happened. That's when I made the choice that changed everything. But I'm not ready to talk about that yet. Not just yet. For now, I just need you to understand where I was coming from. I need you to know that I didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray my husband. It wasn't some cold, calculated decision. It was the slow unraveling of years spent feeling invisible. The quiet, aching loneliness of loving someone who had forgotten how to love you back. They say temptation comes softly, like a whisper in the wind. For me, it came in the form of a man named David. I met him at the hospital where I worked. He wasn't a doctor and he wasn't a patient. He was one of the IT guys sent to fix a network issue in our department. I wouldn't have noticed him at all if he hadn't spoken to me while waiting for his system to reboot. "You look like you've had a long day," he said, his voice warm, cutting through the hum of beeping monitors. I laughed, more out of politeness than amusement. "Long shift." My tone was neutral, careful. But David wasn't the type to be easily dismissed. Over the next few weeks he seemed to appear everywhere: the cafeteria, the staff lounge, the elevator. He had a way of making small talk feel effortless, as though he genuinely cared about what I had to say. At first I thought nothing of it. A little harmless flirting, I told myself. Nothing more. But it wasn't harmless. Not for me. It started with little things. David would bring me coffee during my breaks, always remembering how I liked it, black with a splash of cream. He'd ask about my day, listen when I vented about work, and somehow always managed to make me laugh. Even on days when I didn't feel like smiling. He made me feel seen. And that terrified me. So I tried to pull back. I stopped sitting in the cafeteria, started eating lunch in my car. I avoided the staff lounge, took the stairs instead of the elevator. But no matter how much distance I put between us, David always found a way to slip past my defenses. "You're avoiding me," he said one day, stopping me in the hallway after I hurried past him for the third time that week. Did I do something wrong? I shook my head, keeping my eyes down. "It's not you. I need some space, that's all." David sighed. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but if I've overstepped, I'm sorry. I just like talking to you, that's all." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that we could just be friends. That the connection between us didn't have to mean anything more. But deep down I knew the truth. I was already in too deep. And the first time it happened, when I finally let myself cross the line, I told myself it was an accident. A mistake. At least that's what I wanted to believe. The hospital was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, almost eerie. The usual hum of conversation, the beeping of machines, the hurried footsteps in the hallways had all faded into a heavy stillness. I was sitting alone in the staff lounge, hunched over a pile of paperwork, my mind as exhausted as my body. David walked in without a word, moving with that effortless ease he always had. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, twisted off the cap, and sat down across from me. "You look tired," he said, his voice gentle, like he actually cared about the answer. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. For a long moment we just sat there in silence, the kind of silence that was comfortable but charged with something unspoken. And then, out of nowhere, he reached across the table and took my hand in his. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything, to stop what was happening before it started. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring at our intertwined fingers, feeling the warmth of his skin seep into mine, filling a void I hadn't even realized was there. "It doesn't have to mean anything," he murmured as if reading my mind. "Sometimes people just need someone to lean on." But it did mean something. It meant everything. From that moment on, everything changed. I found myself staying late at work more often, making excuses to linger just a little longer, hoping to steal a few more moments with him. Our conversations became longer, our touches more frequent. The way he looked at me, the way his gaze lingered, there was no mistaking what was happening between us. It was dangerous and exhilarating all at once. For the first time in years, I felt something I thought I had lost. Alive. But with every moment of stolen happiness came the crushing weight of guilt. Every time I came home to James, every time I kissed him goodnight, I felt like a fraud. He was a good man, a kind, hard-working man who had given me everything he had. And yet it wasn't enough anymore. The realization broke something inside me. I tried to justify it. I told myself that James had failed me first, that he was the one who had let our marriage slip through his fingers, that he was the one who stopped trying. But deep down, I knew the truth wasn't that simple. James wasn't a bad husband. He was just tired. Worn down. Maybe as lost as I was. One night, as I lay beside him in bed, listening to his soft, even breaths, I found myself praying. For the first time in years, I whispered a desperate plea into the darkness. I prayed for strength. For clarity. For a way back to the life we had before. But most of all, I prayed for James. I prayed that he would find his way back to me, that he would become the man I had fallen in love with again. Because the truth was, I didn't want to be this woman, the one who cheated, who lied, who betrayed the person who had always stood by her side. I wanted to stop. I wanted to fix what was broken. But I didn't know how. And so, I did the only thing I could. I kept pretending. Pretending that everything was fine. That I was still the loving, faithful wife James believed I was. And all the while, I held on to a fragile hope, that something would change. That he would change. That I could find a way to save us before it was too late. But deep down I already knew. The cracks in our marriage had grown too wide. And I wasn't sure if they could ever be mended. When it finally happened, it wasn't planned, not consciously at least. But if I'm being honest with myself, some part of me had known it was coming for a long time. You don't play with fire and expect not to get burned. David and I had been dancing around the edge for weeks. The lingering touches. The knowing glances. The way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the room. It was all leading to this moment. And I let it happen. I wanted it to happen. It was a Friday night. I had just finished a grueling double shift, my body aching, my mind fogged with exhaustion. When I stepped into the parking lot, David was there, leaning against his car, his familiar, easy smile making my heart skip a beat. "You look exhausted," he said as I approached. "Long day," I murmured, barely able to meet his gaze. "Come on," he said, opening the passenger door. "Let me take you out for a drink. You need to unwind." I hesitated, torn between what I wanted and what I knew was right. But the thought of going home, to another night of James asleep on the couch, to another night of feeling alone in a marriage that was supposed to be my refuge, was too much to bear. "Okay," I said and climbed into the car. We drove to a quiet bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one would recognize us. Over the next couple of hours we talked and laughed like we always did. The tension between us simmered just beneath the surface, in the way his hand brushed mine when he reached for his drink, in the way his eyes lingered on my lips when I spoke. By the time we left, I was buzzing, not just from the wine but from the way David made me feel. Desired. Wanted. I stood beside his car, the night air cool against my skin, my heart hammering in my chest. "I don't want to go home yet," I whispered, barely believing the words had come from my own mouth. David's eyes darkened, his voice low, inviting. "Then don't." I knew what he meant. I knew what he was offering. And for the first time in years I let myself say yes. We drove to a hotel a few miles away, the silence between us thick with anticipation. My hands trembled as I stepped into the dimly lit room, my pulse racing. I had never done anything like this before. I had never betrayed my husband. But in that moment all I could think about was how much I needed this. How much I needed him. David didn't rush. He took his time, his hands and lips exploring me as if memorizing every inch. He made me feel beautiful, cherished, desired in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we finally came together, it was everything I had been craving and more. He lasted longer than James ever had. His touch awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long. For the first time in years I felt truly satisfied, not just physically but emotionally. Afterward, as we lay tangled in the sheets, I felt an ache deep in my chest, a strange mix of relief, guilt, and sadness. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And while part of me regretted it, another part felt like I had finally taken back a piece of myself I had lost. "You deserve to be happy," David murmured, his fingers tracing slow circles on my shoulder. I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I deserve anymore." He pulled me closer, his warmth soothing the storm inside me. "All I know is that you don't have to do this alone." But I was alone. Even with David's arms wrapped around me, even with his body still pressed against mine, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I had betrayed James, the man who had loved me through everything, who had never once doubted me. And for what? A few stolen hours of pleasure? A temporary escape from the emptiness of my marriage? When I finally made it home that night, James was asleep on the couch, the television flickering with the dim glow of a late-night infomercial. I stood there staring at him. And for the first time I truly understood. There was no going back. For a long moment I stood there watching him, my heart heavy with guilt. James looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm that was raging inside me. The quiet hum of the night seemed to surround us, and I ached to wake him, to tell him everything. I wanted to beg him to fight for us, to somehow fix what had broken. But I couldn't. I didn't have the courage to face the truth of what I had done, the mess I had made. So instead I leaned down and kissed his forehead, whispering, "I love you," even though I wasn't sure if that was still true. That night as I climbed into bed beside him, the guilt gnawed at me, relentless and consuming. I prayed harder than I ever had before, praying for James to get better, to find his way back to the man he once was. I prayed for the strength to let go of David, to stop this madness before it destroyed everything. But most of all, I prayed for forgiveness, for James, for David, and for myself. The next morning, James woke up early and made me breakfast, his warm smile as bright as ever. He didn't ask about the night before, didn't inquire why I had come to bed so late. He just handed me a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, kissed me on the cheek, and acted as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if I could ever piece everything back together. After the night with David, everything felt different. It wasn't just the guilt, it was how I started to see everything through a new lens. My life, my marriage, and even James, all of it felt altered, as if I had crossed an invisible line I couldn't uncross. The more I spent time with David, the more I realized that what we had wasn't just about lust. It was about something deeper. It was about the way he made me feel in all the small ways, listened to me, touched me with care, and showed me a kind of attention I hadn't known in years. With James, I felt distant, emotionally disconnected. He tried, bless him. He tried so hard to make me happy, to be the husband I needed him to be. But it was never enough. His efforts, though sweet, only made me feel more like a monster. He came to bed earlier, tried to initiate intimacy more often, but it was always the same, quick, unfulfilling, over before I could even catch my breath. I tried to hide my disappointment, but I think he sensed it. Did I do something wrong? He asked one night, his voice heavy with confusion. I forced a smile. No, of course not. You're perfect. But he wasn't perfect, not in the way I needed him to be. The fact that he was trying so hard only made me feel more guilty, more like a failure. David, on the other hand, was everything James wasn't. He lasted longer, knew exactly how to touch me, how to make me feel things I thought I had lost forever. With him, it wasn't just about the physical. It was about the emotional connection, the intimacy in ways I hadn't known in years. With David, I felt wanted. I felt alive. But the more time I spent with him, the more I started to realize that what we had was unsustainable. It couldn't go on forever. One afternoon, as we lay tangled in the sheets of yet another hotel room, David turned to me with a look of longing in his eyes. I wish I could keep you all to myself, he said, his words a punch to my gut. I turned away, avoiding his gaze. You know that's not possible. But what if it could be? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. What if you left him? We could start over. Just you and me. The words hung in the air, suffocating me. I sat up, pulling the sheet around me like armor. Don't do this, David. Don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not trying to make it harder, he said, sitting up beside me. I'm just saying what we both know is true. You're not happy with him. You haven't been for a long time. Why keep pretending? I didn't have an answer for him. I couldn't speak the truth aloud, not yet. I wasn't ready. Instead, I just shook my head. It's not that simple. David sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. It could be if you let it. I didn't respond. Deep down, I knew he was right. I hadn't been happy with James for a long time, but leaving him, that felt like a betrayal on a whole new level. When I got home that night, James was waiting for me in the kitchen, a concerned look on his face. Everything okay? He asked, his eyes searching mine for answers. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Why? You've just been different lately, he said, his brow furrowed. Distant. I don't know. It's like something's off. I wanted to tell him everything right then and there. I wanted to pour out the truth, to beg for his forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't say them. Instead, I whispered, I'm fine. Work's just been stressful, that's all. He nodded, though I could tell he didn't entirely believe me. If there's something going on, you can tell me. You know I'm here. I know, I replied, my voice barely audible. I know. But I didn't tell him. I couldn't. Not yet. That night, as I lay in bed beside James, the weight of my choices crushed me. I wanted to stop seeing David. I wanted to end the affair, to focus on rebuilding the marriage I had with James. But every time I thought about ending things with David, a pang of sadness gripped me. I didn't want to lose him. He had become my escape, the refuge from the emptiness that had overtaken my marriage. But I also knew that I couldn't keep living this double life. As I closed my eyes that night, I prayed again. God, please, I whispered, my tears soaking the pillow. Help me find a way out of this. Help James get better. Help us. I didn't know if my prayers would be answered, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. The day I finally spoke to James about his condition was one of the hardest of my life. I had rehearsed the conversation 1,000 times in my mind, trying to find the right words, the right way to bring up something so personal without completely crushing him. But when the time came,